Dorkules, here of glue and paint fumes, Dorkules shouldn't have ate those mushrooms, creepy are his eyes, fire in his thighs, with the strength of 10, receding hair old men, it's the mighty Dorkules.
Oh man, what's the matter with that guy? You Generation Z marsupials didn't like and subscribe to the channel, I'm gonna come over there and kick your ass, you just wait and see.
Oh no!
You and that little turtlings can't even make a sandwich.
Go to my safe space, go to my safe space.
Ain't no safe space for you, you little ginger wanker.
I'm offended.
I'm gonna shake your hipster friend till he shits his eyeballs.
Your channel sucks.
You better like and subscribe to the channel or you're in deep shit.
I'm going to take my geeky hobby stash home and do some glue sniffing.
Like and subscribe.
Hello and welcome back to Miniature Dork Universe, the place where hobby time success stories never end. Today we are going to build up and paint these Anschluss 12mm or 1/144 scale M4A1 Shermans. I say Anschluss, but two of them are Anschluss and the third one is from eBay. And I bought that one because it had the newer track suspension on it. So I thought I would mix one in. But it's essentially the same kit, I think. It looks very similar. The only difference is you have to glue the tracks on. And I already glued them on, so you won't get the benefit of seeing that. But just imagine, a middle-aged guy gluing some tracks on with a bit of super glue. Here there's also some, because they're 3D prints, there's some little bits of plastic and things you have to break off. There's not much to assemble otherwise. So when I say assembly, I mean I'm going to fix up the turrets so that they're magnetized. I'm going to add a couple 50 caliber machine guns. I'm going to put some stowage on the back, as well as some photoetch stuff. So let's get on with it. I begin by sanding off the bottom of the turret a bit with wet, dry sandpaper. Sand it wet so that you don't get a big cloud of resin dust, because if you breathe too much of that in, you'll pass out and wake up in a pool of pee wondering where you are. And we want to avoid that because, like I mentioned before, we just do success stories around here. We don't do any failure stories. So give her a little sand with some wet, dry sandpaper. And then instead of having a big mess, you just have this like slurry of sludge that you can rinse down the sink. With that done, I'm going to trace the outline of the rare earth magnets. In this case, these are 5mm rare earth magnets. I'm going to trace them onto the bottom of the turret. And then once those are done, I'm going to use an engraving tool to engrave out a little seat for the magnet, so that once that's glued in there, that should keep it nice and secure. Having traced that on, I'll put a steel engraver bit into my engraving pen. If you're not familiar with this lovely little device, I highly recommend that you get one. It's a similar idea to a Dremel, but it's much, much smaller. You might still need to have a Dremel as well because the Dremel has a more powerful engine than this. But for doing something like this, it's great. Or I use this, and I'll probably do a video on this in the future too. This was one of the things in my poll, but I use this for fixing up resin. Like if you get a resin building and it's got a shitty casting job and there's, you want to reshape it, this is great for doing stuff like that. But in this case, I'm going to use it to make a shallow seat that's just deep enough so that the magnet will sit flush with the bottom of the turret here. But yeah, this has variable speeds, and it's just a very useful tool to have, and it's not very expensive. These only cost, I think this one cost me under $40. dollars Canadian. And here we go with the engraving tool. I recommend here that you wear a dust mask because, again, you don't want to inhale this shit. Otherwise, your hands are going to get shaky and you might just blurt out random obscenities. So here's one of the things about the engraver tool that's great, because it's like a pen. It's very easy to control. The Dremel is sometimes clumsy and big, and my Dremel vibrates quite a bit. It's quite old, so it's probably just because it's old. But here you can see you have a lot of control with this. So it's used for engraving, so obviously it's controllable and you can make a lot of nice shapes with it. So keep this in mind if you're going to be doing terrain, especially if you're making buildings and things. It's easy to carve out like stone textures and things like that. When I'm done getting the basic shape sort of ground out, I'll switch the bit and move on to that sort of drum shaped diamond bit that's just to the right of my tank. I'm not going to get into that and do all that. We'll keep this video shorter, but the drum is a diamond bit and it's less aggressive than the steel bit. So I get the basic shape in and then I'll square out the edges with the drum bit. Now I'm going to use an X-Acto knife and make pilot holes for all of the things I'm going to drill out with a pin vise. So that would be the gun barrel and the antenna housings. So yeah, I use the X-Acto knife to put in sort of a pilot hole just to get it centered. If you try to go directly with the drill bit, it might dance around and you might get a real crappy outcome. I get my magnification goggles on so I can see this really close and make sure that the knife is nice and centered, and then I'll get my pilot hole nice and centered. However, be careful because as you can see, it's also easy to put that knife through your fingertip. And when that happens, you scream with rage and it doesn't feel like a success story. However, it still is a success story. One way or another, this is going to be a smashing success. It's just sometimes it involves more swearing and bleeding than others. So let's try to stay on the pathway to the fun success story instead of the hard success story, and just be careful with the knife. Here's another tool that is essential for geeky hobby times, at least that's what I think, a pin vise. This allows you to drill it out. Could you imagine actually using a drill to do this? That being said, having just said that, right now I'm thinking you can put drill bits in that little miniature engraver. So, it might work. But yeah, when you're drilling down the center of something this small, I think you want to get more control. And this will prevent that little drill bit from going right into your fingertip. Yeah, and we want to prevent that. Except if you're in some kind of like freaky club in Germany where, that kind of stuff is considered fun. But around my house, it's not considered fun. So let's avoid that. I've gone around and drilled out all the gun barrels and these antenna housings. I've actually ballsed up a couple of them. So I'm going to replace them with housings that I make out of chunks of syringe, which sounds a little bit crazy, but it's going to be good. Here I'm also going to put, for two of the tanks, I'm going to put M2 50 caliber machine gun mounts on, and they're going to be very basic. I'm not going to model them up super realistic. So this hatch has been like rotated so that the orientation of the hatch is kind of like facing a different direction than it normally is, but that's fine. I can still put the machine gun mount where it would be. And in the hole that I drill out, I'll use some plastic rod and drill another little hole to accept the pin in the little 3D printed machine gun that I'm going to use. To make new housings for the antennas that I bunged up, I'm going to cut off sections of syringe using this jeweler's miter block. So I want to make something so that, the antenna isn't going to snap off super easily. Otherwise, there's not much point putting them on. And if I can't put an aerial on a model that's going to be secure, I just leave it out. It's not a big deal. It looks kind of cool. So if I can do it, I will. But yeah, I have certain, like my Panzer II that I just made, it's so small that if you put the aerial on, it's just going to get broken off super easy. So yeah, if you ever get like a miter box similar to this, when you're cutting it, you have to cut it in multiple directions because the blade is going to get snag once it starts to cut. You have to also put some wax on the blade. You can use beeswax or candle wax, but yeah, if you try to just power through it, it's going to snap the saw blade time and time again. And after you snap about 6 saw blades, you kind of want to punch some inanimate objects. Yeah, so keep moving the block around as you cut through. Once those are cut, I super glue them into place where the old radio mast, I drilled a hole to accept that, and that will keep that antenna from breaking off. Hypodermic syringe is really useful stuff to have as well. You know, getting this stainless steel tubing that's really tiny, what more needs to be said? It's awesome stuff. So they're fairly cheap and you can get them at drugstores. I also glued in the plastic rod that I'm going to mount the machine guns on. It's a little bit overly thick, but that's just to keep the machine guns from getting broken off because they're so small. And it's so small that, you know, it's going to look big here on the screen, but in reality, you don't really notice it because it's so tiny. But I just wanted something that was fairly beefy to peg these guns in. The machine guns are really nice, but a lot of them came with the barrels kind of bent, and I tried using hot water to bend them straight, and it worked initially, but then over time the guns just keep curling up a little bit. So that's a bit disappointing. I don't like that so much, but otherwise they look really nice and they fit well into these little posts that I put in. When I'm installing the rare earth magnets into turrets, to figure out the polarity, I stick two together, and as they're sandwiched together, I sand the exposed ends. They want to kind of slide around and sometimes they come apart, but just keep putting them back together. And the sanding will also create a better gluing surface, but it also, you know that the sanded side is the side that's going towards the glue, and the clean side is the side where the magnets want to meet. And that's how you know that your polarity is going to be correct, because if you get your polarity incorrect, instead of sticking the magnet on, it's going to push the turret off. And again, we are working for the success story, and that's not a success story. In fact, it's quite shitty. So you can avoid that with this method. I'm going to speed this next part up. So for these magnets, in this particular tank, I used the 2-part epoxy. I used it because the magnet that's going in the hull, I'm simply going to drop it in a big glop of that putty and center it. Just because I found it would be easier than putting that little, seat down inside so deep. It's quite deep in there. So as you can see, I've just dropped the magnet in, and I'm going to center it with a toothpick. And if it has some of the putty on top, that's really good, actually. That's going to really seal it in. So when you're doing this, the only thing to watch out for is that you get your sanded side down towards the glue. And it's a bit challenging to drop it in so that you get it that way, because if it goes in and your sanded side is facing up, it's kind of a dick to flip it over. So try to get it in sanded side down. And then I'm going to use the same kind of glue to stick this in to the turrets too, these magnets. It's tougher and it's not as brittle as crazy glue. So just normally I would use super glue, but I have some excess out, so I'm going to use this stuff. And it's going to be a jolly strong bond, which is what we like. Here I've added the machine guns and the radio antennas, and for that I just use regular super glue to put those in. I made the antennas out of 10 gauge guitar string. You might have seen me use this before, but in case you haven't, if this is your first video, I'm not going to go into the full round of how I do it. You can see it in some of my previous videos, but I will just say make sure that you really sand down one of the tips, like the tip that's facing out, so that you don't punch that through your fingertip, because that doesn't feel good either. You can blunt off the ends though, and then yeah, they don't stick too easily into flesh. And also when you snip, use crappy snippers, because they're steel guitar strings, and the steel is going to pit the hell out of the jaws. So if you have really nice snips that you're using, like spruce snips or something, don't use those, because you're going to dent the shit out of them. And yeah, just remember to blunt the end. So you can, with the steel, you can use a steel file. I use a bit of steel file and a bit of, carbide sandpaper, and use like a 400 or something, and just sand any sort of flash and any sort of sharpness off the tip of that. And I just lightly tap my finger on it to make sure that it's, if it's still really sharp, it's gonna hurt even when you just lightly tap it. So you want to avoid that for sure. And if you have small kids, I would avoid using guitar string altogether, because they're going to put that right through their eye, and that is definitely not going to be cool. Then I added stowage to it. And the stowage is from various manufacturers. There's some from Scale Fiend, Pendraken, and Arrowhead. And typically with stowage, I just buy stowage. As soon as I see, if I'm looking around online and if I see stowage that looks good, I just buy it. And I have a whole sort of pool of stowage, a collection of it, so that I can just sort of tinker through it and grab what I need. And yeah, I find it's better that way, just to have it available instead of trying to buy little bits of stowage here and there. Get a great big bag of it and then you will have more fun and more successful hobby times. But when you look at pictures of Shermans, here we'll get a nice picture of a Sherman in fact, you can see that the rear deck is just covered in stowage, and you can also see some of the things like packs and helmets hanging off the turret. You can actually snip those off of excess figures. I was just too slack to do that in this case, but I have done it in the past. And the more stowage you can drape over the thing, the cooler it kind of looks. And it gives each tank its own sort of distinct look, its own personality, and they are kind of motley, so that's kind of fun. With this stuff added, now I'm just going to put the photo etch tools on, and also on the one tank, the one I ordered off eBay that came from China, there's a little piece missing, a section here off that cover. So I'm just going to put a bit of green stuff down there and make a camouflage net, fold it up. If you remember in the previous photo, there was a lot of camouflage nets sitting on the back, so it seems like a likely thing to put on. And that's all I'll have to say about stowage. Now I've put on all of the photo etched Pioneer tools. So to position them, I used a scale drawing, and it's always good to have a lot of those on hand. But you can usually just find one when you're on the internet. If you do an internet search, just type in, scale drawing of M4A1, which is exactly what I did. I got this one here. I'll just post it up here. On the one side, I couldn't get the tools on exactly the way they went, because the actual model is kind of not 100%. There's these sort of loading hooks that are on the back, and they're too far forward, so they were too far forward to get the tools exactly as per the drawings. But I just went for it and did something close. I'm not, for a 12 millimeter model for gaming, I'm not going to get, I'm not entering it into a modeling contest. I do try to get things as close to reality as I can within reason, but if it's going to, take way too much time, then I'll put it down. But I think it definitely looks better with the tools on than without. They're kind of a predominant part of the M4A1, or any model of Sherman for that matter. So this is the stowage and tool part done, and that's pretty much the basic construction done. I'm just going to do that green stuff putty bit, and then we'll get on to painting. So here's the finished green stuff piece of camouflage net. I put a blob of green stuff down there and added the texture by poking it in with the end of a file, I think it was. And I keep poking it until it looks like a net, basically. It's actually pretty easy. Now we're on to painting. I use Tamiya paints for my airbrush. I find they have a nice tough finish. And so for American tanks, I use olive drab and dark yellow. And in this scale, they're almost 1-to-1 mix. So I fired up my airbrush with the paint, and it was a 1-to-1 mix, maybe with a touch more of the olive green, but pretty close to 1-to-1. If you use 1-to-1, that's nice and easy. When it's this small though, it's going to look darker. So make sure you lighten it down quite a bit, and make sure you do several thin coats, because a thick coat might take the detail right off of something this small. So keeping nice thin coats, keep moving the piece as you're painting it. It's a good way. Keep the airbrush at a nice distance. And after I got the base coat on, I did like a panel highlighting with an even lighter coat. So whatever paint was left in the cup, I just added even more of the dark yellow. Also, I added more thinner for the highlights. So here I'm just doing a basic sort of panel highlight. It's sort of in between a modulation and panel highlight. I'm not using any masking or anything. I'm being very haphazard. Only one of these Shermans is going to remain straight up green, and the other two are going to have camouflage patterns. Here I wanted to avoid doing the silly putty masking too, just because it's so small, and I wanted to get a more elaborate sort of pattern in. So it's just easier to paint. In reality, they were sprayed on, but once again, it's so small, I don't think it matters. I'm going to use a brush. For the camouflage, I decided to go for this orangey tan color, which is called Field Drab. That's from the awesome AK Real Colors of World War II book. I recommend that one for anyone that's painting World War II. Then I go online and try to find the right camouflage patterns, just as a guide for my painting. For Field Drab, I started off with orange brown, and then I mixed in some of the desert yellow. Oh, those are Vallejo paints, by the way. And it's one part of the orange brown and one part of the desert yellow, which gives you a nice easy 1-to-1 ratio. When I'm painting camouflage patterns, I roughen the patterns first by painting in the borders, and then I'll roughly just add some of the paint on the inside of the area I want to paint, because otherwise it's easy to paint in the negative space that you don't want to paint, and that never feels good. So just put a few hash marks inside the area where you want to paint. And once you have that all sorted out, you can start filling it in. And I usually do that in about 2 or 3 light coats. And there they are, all painted up with the camouflage patterns. So I did 2 in the camouflage, and I'm going to leave one just straight up green. And one of them I've added underneath white, kind of like what the British and Commonwealth did in North Africa. They put white paint under the shaded areas so that the shadows wouldn't be quite as strong. I just thought that was a fun little thing to add for one of them. I saw a picture of it in this Osprey book. And now on to the final colors for all the stowage and tracks and such. Now all the colors have been painted in. I'm not going to go into detail for all the colors that I used. I used black gray for the tracks and for the road wheels, and they're going to get a heavy dust wash, so I wasn't too particular about that. I used the black gray for the machine gun and the radio aerial, and then the stowage bits on the back are just various like khakis and greens, that kind of stuff. The fuel cans and things, I just used other olive drabs that were slightly different than my base color just to make it a little bit different. But yeah, this will get too long if I go into each color, and your guess is as good as mine. You know, I just guessed. The next step is to give it an overall coat of Tamiya Clear, so it's like a gloss varnish. And I thin that down quite a bit, and I do several light coats. You don't want the varnish to go on super thick because once again it might start to drown out the details in something this small. But as a rule, you always, no matter what scale you're working in, you want your paints to go in thin coats that you build up. Now that the gloss coat is on, we're on to my favorite task, which is putting on the decals. And it makes it especially nice when you have excellent decals like these from Scale Specialties. So it's on 2 sheets. I've just cut them down into smaller pieces to make them more manageable. And you get all of the decals you will need for, you know, North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. And all the specific things like the stars with the yellow circles around them and the blue registration numbers. It's all there in these sets. Once the decals are applied and the setting solution is sit overnight to let it do its thing, I brush paint another coat of the clear over top of the decals. So just get a nice soft bristle brush and put a light coat, and that's going to seal in all of the decals, and so they'll be very resilient to handling. Next we'll move into washes, and on this project I used 2 different washes together. I used the MiG ammo washes with the Citadel washes, and I really like the effect. I used the Citadel washes overall, and then I used the MiG washes to get all the deeper shadows and things like that. So yeah, I'll show you how that turned out, but I really like it, and I think it saved time. So I started off with the MiG dust wash for all the tracks, and that was actually a general wash I used for the tracks. I just said I used Citadel for the sort of general overall wash, but here I use this, and then fuck what I said, here's a third wash. I just make my own with acrylic paint sometimes. I wanted a lighter color to sort of highlight the dust wash. It's very yellowy. So I'll put this on first, and then in select areas I'll lay down some of the lighter wash. So with the tracks, I sprayed Flow Improver on it first to help the washes run into all of the areas. The Flow Improver you mix down with water. If you've seen my videos, you've seen me use this stuff before, but it makes the wash behave more like an oil wash. Sorry, it looks like the tank is out of focus, for the love of God. But I think you can get the point here. I'm just very generally putting this over everything. I'm not doing any kind of a pin wash type thing. And I'm just going to go over that until the whole thing has a general coat. I put some on the lower part of the hull and all around the tracks. And something I'll say here is when it goes on, it's going to look very bright and contrasty. But when it dries, it really, you know, you lose a lot of that contrast. It's not super bright, which I like. You know, it dries looking a bit more realistic, or, you know, maybe just more subdued. I'm sure realistically this could have so much dust on it that you can't even see any of the original colors underneath. But I use weathering as a way to enhance the overall finish. So I'm not always going for 100% accurate. You know, I want it to look like dust, but I still want, you know, there's no point painting things when you just cover it with so much weathering that you can't really see what's underneath, you know, and that's fine to do. Oops, looks like you want to avoid that when your tank goes flying off. But I've built these things pretty resilient, so they look kind of delicate, but they're not. I usually build them so that they'll stand up to a bit of abuse. So anyway, I'm going to continue on with this MIG wash, and then we'll pick up again with the next color, which is going to be the Artist Acrylic Liquitex. I use half-decent acrylics for making washes, but I have used the crappy ones in the past too, and they're actually fine. The key is to mix them down with a lot of water, but also put something in to break the surface tension, i.e. that flow improver. And with this, I'm going to mostly mix it with flow improver. And then it behaves more like an oil wash. It's the surface tension of water that kind of messes up the capillary action, and which, the oils don't have that same surface tension. That's why they work so well. But the flow improver helps to, combat that. Still not quite as good as oils, but then you're not introducing like oil underneath of an acrylic coat, which I try and avoid. Once again, my tank is out of focus. I apologize, but I think you can still see what's going on here. I'm just putting this on select areas. I'm not going to do like a general wash. The dust wash is dried, and then I'm just picking some higher areas, or if there's spots where the dust wash didn't really stay, then I'll come back in with this, and it just gives it a bit of color variation, and it looks pretty good. And like with the dust wash, when this dries, it's going to be way less contrasty than what you're seeing it going on here. But you'll see the finished result near the end. Sorry about the out of focus. I found out later that I hit my f-stops on my lens. Something I forgot to mention with the previous dust wash too is at this point I put rain streaks on. So I used the ammo wash to do this, and now I'm using the acrylic paint wash to do this. So the majority of the streaks are the dust wash, and I'm just going to put a few of the lighter ones on, and then when I use the darker colors, I'll put a few of the darker ones on. So the way I do this is I get a bit on the brush, and then I just work the streak in until it sort of feathers out. It ends up looking like oil paint. If you leave it on really wet, it's going to look more like a stain than a streak. So keep going back over it, and if you need to wet the brush, I have some water. It's outside of the picture field here, but I'm wetting the brush at points and sort of drying it off a little bit on a cloth, and then coming back and just keep working them until your streaks are looking pretty nice. And if it gets a little bit overboard, you can just take some straight up water and sort of tone it down a bit. Next up is the Citadel washes, which I'm going to use generally over the top parts of the tank and some of the lower parts too around the running gear. If you see any areas where you kind of want to shade up, then hit it with this. And I like using this because you don't really have to pin wash. You can sort of brush the Citadel washes over the areas that you want shading, and then you can kind of blend it out around, so you don't have to sort of go through and pin wash, where I find the ammo washes, you have to do like a really careful and specific pin wash, or else it looks really messed up. This you can be a bit more haphazard and quick. I move around to all of the surface details and just hit it with the wash, and then if there's any areas where it kind of pools or where it's kind of staining, I'll come back with some water and just blend it out. But it goes pretty well, and the Citadel washes, they shade a little different. It's a little less stark and contrasty, but it has a really nice effect. And then where I want the really stark contrast, that's where I'll hit it with the MIG ammo washes, which are quite good at that. I think this might be some kind of an ink, and the ammo washes are more like some kind of a, like a ground up sort of pigment. They look a bit more like watercolors or something to me. Next up was Citadel Nuln Oil, and that's kind of a black color, and I just put that over the entire machine gun, the 50 cal. And if you had any areas on the tank that you wanted to darken up even further, you could use some of this. Sometimes I mix it with the Agrax Earthshade too, and that ends up looking pretty good, but I'm just going to coat the entire machine gun with this. Now we're on to the ammo dark wash, which is a very, very dark brown. And I'm going to use this to shade in things like the openings of hatches and, you know, around any hatch basically, or anywhere where you want a really deep shadow. And for this I'm going to do it like a pin wash. So you're just touching a fine tip brush into the actual area you want to shade and just let the capillary action pull that into the area. So for example, on this turret, the one thing about this kit I wish is that they had the hatch oriented the other way instead of front to back, side to side. Now these commander cupolas, they rotated, so you can have it this way, but most commonly you see it in the other direction. Here I'm using it around the outlines of the gun just to make that stand out a little more. So basically anything you want to just put in deeper shade, use this, and it worked out really nice in combination with the Citadels. The final wash I'm going to use is the MIG black wash, and I'm going to use that to darken up the ends of the gun barrel. And if I had like a really predominant exhaust on this, sometimes I use this to make exhaust stains. You can sort of feather it out and it looks pretty good. Now I'll airbrush on a coat of ultramatte varnish from AK, which is great stuff. I highly recommend it. And then once that's done, I didn't show you the airbrush stage because you know what that looks like. Once it's done, I'm going to highlight everything by mixing a lighter color in with the base colors that I used. So for the Tamiya olive drab, I used Vallejo brown violet. I think now it's called US olive drab, and mixed it in with beige. But all the other colors, just take whatever colors you chose and then mix in a lighter version of that for your highlights. There's a bit of the printer texture, there's sort of like little lines going across in certain areas of the tank, and I avoided dry brushing for that reason. I used a fine tip paintbrush to go in and do most of this because I didn't want to bring out those sort of line patterns too extensively. It's very small though, so when it's on the table away from your face, you don't really see them. They're really predominant at the front of the tank near the bottom where I put the bridge classification number, but I tried to negate those showing up as much as I could. With all the highlighting done, I went in with a 2B pencil, and on things like the idler wheel, I kind of made a metallic texture, and the sprocket teeth and the Pioneer tools. I don't do this with the machine gun though. I used paint to highlight that. I just used a lighter color of the gray. And then I took some of this deco art as a final thing. I pulled the tank off the little carry handle, and I'm going to heavily dry brush that on the bottom. It's not like you see the bottom, but you know, I'm just being kind of OCD here. Got to put something on the bottom to cover up all the spots where they were attached. You don't really have to. You could totally skip this. But I also used some of the sand paint to make a few dried up mud spots on the side of the tank, like just very minimally. And it ended up looking pretty good. I'm going to speed this little part up so that you can get through this video. We're near the end. This is my final step. So as you can see, it's very haphazard. I'm imagining the bottom of this would be totally crusted with mud or dust, so there it is. You could even streak it up if you wanted to, but that might be going a bit overboard. And then with a small brush, I'm putting little dried up dust spots on the side of the tank. Yay, we got focus back. Just very small amounts. It almost has a similar effect to chipping, but it's a nice little detail to add, especially when you have all the rain streaks. So here we are finished. This is the final result, and I'm pretty chuffed with how it turned out. In this particular project, I learned about using two different kinds of washes together. I usually try to try something different on each project, and that's how you really get ahead with modeling. Just try things out and do it in small increments so you don't have any major disasters, and you'll usually learn something, or you'll learn also what not to do. This can really streamline your working style, and then over time you develop sort of a way of doing things, and then even though something like this might seem like a really long-winded project, it's not. Once you get all of your techniques down, all of this becomes a lot faster. The big challenge I had with this kit was trying to get those 50 caliber machine guns to go straight, and I'll have to say that that was a bit of a letdown, but just a bit of a letdown. They still look nice. I used really hot water from our tap. Our tap gets super hot, and I bent them straight, and initially they were straight, but over time they started to bend a little bit. So they have a bit of a bend, but as you can see when they're sort of down on the table, you don't really notice it so much, and from certain angles you can't even notice it at all. So it still looks better with a machine gun than without. It's a pretty common thing to have on the roof of a Sherman. So overall I would say they're pretty good. These ones are from Scale Fiend. I haven't found any 50 calibers that have the same amount of detail in this scale. But yeah, you do have to deal with some of those bendy barrels. So that's going to be it for this round of Miniature Dork Universe. As always, thank you for watching and liking and subscribing. If you do, don't be intimidated by the alien threats. It's all in good humor or bad humor, depending on your point of view. But I do appreciate you watching and, the other stuff. So we'll see you next time for more hobby time excellence and maybe the odd calamity.
Luna, lunetta, rubana, fetta, fetta, luna, canna, del sol. Luna, lunetta, rubana, fetta, fetta, luna, canna, del sol. Luna, lunetta. Oli, 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 sette femmine nuteri, nuteri è troppo poco, sette femmine nuove al poco, sette femmine nuteri, oli, 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 sette femmine nuove al poco, nuteri è troppo poco, sette femmine nuove al poco, nuteri è troppo poco. Shit, a figlia. E l'uva toga dolce dolce, sette femmine penna noce, la noce diffidente, sette femmine non si pende, di femmine penna luce, l'uva toga dolce dolce, sette femmine non si pendi, e la noce diffidente, di femmine non si pendi, e la noce diffidente. Ah figlia, ci piace un vero uomo, costa un poco. E lui si prende scendi e quando non vive alla vacca mi ricorda non vive alla donna, la vive alla vacca, non si prende scendi e quando non vive alla donna, che la vacca mi ricorda, la vive alla donna, che la vacca mi ricorda. Un sumano con chianta ruba e fuma caso pizzo. E la donna scendi io